Thank you for coming in to our third video today on the Kingdoms of the Dwarves. This is the Lore Master, and I'm so glad to see you back at World's Edge, our newest channel on lore in the fantasy worlds. Today we're going to be talking about Warhammer Fantasy again. This includes Warhammer Fantasy Tabletop, and also, of course, Warhammer Fantasy on the computer, including the Total War franchise. Today's topic is going to be the Kingdoms of the Dwarves, or as they call it, the Karaz Ankor. Now, the Karaz Ankor stretches across the entirety of the World's Edge Mountains, which is the mountain range that extends across the entirety of the easternmost portion of the Old World, bordering the Empire, the Chaos Wastes, and then the Darklands. You have Nehekara down here, the Badlands, Talia, the Empire, Chaos Dwarves, Nagash, so on and so forth. The Dwarves originated around the same time the Elves did, being created by the Old Ones as part of the Great Plan, and surviving the culling that the Lizard Men had been put into place to create. For what purposes we do not yet know, and possibly won't, because the end times, of course, did occur. And then when they originated, they did start in the Southlands, moving north and establishing their holds or settlements throughout the World's Edge Mountains. And then again, also, as we're going to find out as we go through this presentation, throughout the entirety of the Old World. You'll notice that Dwarven settlements, rather than human ones, are all based around mountains, rather than in confluences of rivers or otherwise geographic locations of importance, such as those done by humans or elves. This is because for dwarves, the most important thing for them are going to be mineral resources. So, for example, Mount Gundabad up here, Mount Gunbad up here, got some Lord of the Rings lore there, is founded on the largest deposit of Brightstone, which is a stone that glows in the dark and is important for founding holds with. Whereas Karak Varn is a large deposit of Gromril, which is the equivalent of Mithril in the Warhammer world. Karak Izor, a large deposit of copper, so on and so forth. This isn't to say that some holds are not founded on trading posts. Barak Var, for example, is a large trading post, and Karak Ravensnak, which is a Norse hold founded right about there, is also a trading post founded for its proximity to water. And this is just to say that the dwarves did found all of their holds with either an economic or or military purpose in mind, just as humans did. So as we go through the holds, you will see that they do have an in-game and also in-game kind of geographical or political purpose as well, so that when you're creating your theming, it'll be easy to do that. And that ultimately is the reason that the lore is interesting from a gaming perspective, is because when you're making your army or you're modding for Total War, you want to be able to find something that you can latch onto and creates the basis for all of your efforts there. If you're going to create, say, an army from Karak Zorn, you may want to create some additional lizard themes, either mounts for your artillery or different kinds of shields, or if you're going to do a Norse theme for your army, maybe you want to throw in some chaos accrements, or some sea themes for your Barak Var themed army, so on and so forth. And that's what this video will help you do, is identify what kinds of themes you may want to use going forward, or maybe you just want to hear about the lore of dwarves in the Warhammer setting. How you use this is up to you. As far as dwarves in general, their personalities are very similar to other kinds of fantasy dwarves. They're known for their stout, hardworking personalities, stubbornness. They're famous for brewing ales and smithing fine craftsmanship. Stout buildings, armor, weapons, toys, and any kind of craftsmanship they're pretty much the best at in the Warhammer world, and have been since time immemorial. Where they differ from some other fantasy realms is that the dwarves in the past, so about 4,500 years prior to the current end times in the Warhammer world, the dwarves were a great empire stretching all across the known world, until they clashed with the elves in what's called the War of the Beard or the War of Vengeance, depending on which side you were on in the war. And while the dwarves did emerge victorious from it, nearly the entirety of their military strength was spent, and once that war ended about 500 years after that, there was another conflict called the Goblin Wars, which did see many of their holds decimated. And we're going to be exploring what the world looks like now rather than what it looked like at the height of their power. And that's a large part of their culture now, is that bitterness and hopelessness that comes from having now almost 4 millennia of losing so much of their people and culture. So with that little history lesson out of the way, let's go ahead and jump right into it. As we talked about, the dwarves emerged from the Southlands, so the southernmost continent, roughly Africa in our culture, and they went up along the World's Edge Mountains, founding holds, and then moving northward as they're directed by their ancestor gods Grungi, Grimnir, and Valea. As of right now, the holds are almost all very much destroyed after the loss of losses in the Goblin Wars. However, they have been, for the purposes of storyline especially, recovered to an extent. Now, unfortunately, this is not true for Karak Draz, which is still in the possession of the orcs. And it is actually the largest orc encampment in the World's Edge Mountains, that of Black Crag under Gorfag. But Karak 8 Peaks has been recovered. It is under the command. It was once the largest hold in the World's Edge Mountains, second only and possibly and definitely rivaling Karaz the capital of the dwarves. Called the Queen of the Silver Peaks, Silver Depths, sorry. It was enormous. As you can see here, it was known for having a full 8 peaks, and it's an extensive work, even by dwarf standards. They could raise massive armies. Their wealth was considered boundless, and the only thing that stopped them was unfortunately the losses incurred by the war with the goblins and the Skaven, which happened exactly at the same time for them. Currently, Be'lakor the king of the last king of Karak 8 Peaks, has reestablished control of the citadel. So in gaming terms, he's established a small foothold at the very top of what was once his kingdom, his birthright, and leads constant raids deeper into Karak 8 Peaks with the goal of reclaiming treasures. He can't possibly hope to reclaim the entire hold because he doesn't have hundreds of thousands of dwarves to do so. But that's a great place for you to start, and you can always look to books such as the War of Vengeance series for inspiration as to what a historic Karak 8 Peaks army might have looked like if you're looking to kind of draw inspiration for what they might find inside of the Karak 8 Peaks as far as treasures. Now moving down a little bit, we have Karak Azgal, once named Karak Israel, one of the wealthiest and known for its gems. Karak Azgal was one of the third to fall, I believe, during the war with the goblins, and it was reclaimed eventually, almost recently, about 500 years before the current time period, by Scalf Dragon Tamer, and it's now currently a reclaimed hold where adventurers set out in the Warhammer roleplay universe. So you can definitely use that as a great location to set out and reclaim have some great fight against dwarves. Against orcs and goblins. There's not much known about what their arms and armament look like, but they are still there now. It is a reclaimed hold. At least partially. It is still overrun with Skaven and orcs and goblins, but it is partially dwarven again. Karak Azul is fully reclaimed. It is under the command of Thorik Ironbrow, and also its king Cazador, and it's actually not recorded that it ever fell, but it is a fully manned and operated dwarven hold, and currently commands the southern passes of the World's Edge Mountains. It is from here that the dwarves maintain their presence in the south, and they offer support to all of the kings of the region. Thorik Ironbrow is known for his traditionalism. He's also one of, if not the greatest runesmith of the age, and is shown on the tabletop wielding an Anvil of Doom, as one of the few runesmiths who's willing to go into battle still on one, since they're incredibly rare, having been forged at the time of Grungni, the ancestor god, and no one being left alive to actually create them any longer. King Cazador, for his part, is known for being an extremely strong, even for a dwarf. In his youth, actually entertaining his people by lifting up huge ore-laden carts with his bare hands. But in the current age is older and more sober and more depressed, having lost his family to orcs and goblins. And those are all, unfortunately, that's pretty much the story of the dwarves in a nutshell. Better times in the past, now just fighting orcs and goblins. But as we move up the World's Edge Mountains a little bit, things get a little bit brighter. The northern World's Edge Mountains fell just as hard to the orcs and goblins, but they've managed to rally just a little bit better. The capital of the dwarves itself is here, as are several of their principal settlements. Karaz is 100% the capital of the dwarves, being the head of all of their major temples, their most populous settlement, and having never fallen to an invader in any sense, and is considered completely impregnable. Its rune lord is the most venerable dwarf alive currently, Crag the Grim, and its king Thorgrim Grudgebearer is currently the High King of the Dwarves, and is leading what he has called the Age of Reckoning, where he is aiming to strike as many grudges from the Book of Grudges as possible. Warhammer took the idea of grudges, or holding grudges, from Tolkien's dwarves to a whole other level, and made it a part of their culture and politics. Essentially, whenever something is wronged to a dwarf, whether it's a murder or a settlement being sacked, or even just a debt not being paid to a merchant, it's recorded in the Book of Grudges, whether it's a personal Book of Grudges, or even a settlement's Book of Grudges, or the entire Karaz Ankor's Book of Grudges. And then it must be paid either in blood or gold, or whatever the terms of the recovery, but it's usually blood or gold. So the High King of the Dwarves in this case, such as this picture here, is shown on the throne of power, which he is born into battle on traditionally, striking grudges from his book by fighting in combat. And that is what his that's how he's played on the tabletop, and that is how he also leads the dwarven people. Traditionally, in this time in the game, he is leading the entire Karaz Ankor in a way not seen in centuries or even millennia, having united both the Norse dwarves and the southern dwarves through acts of personal and political fealty. He reinstated the Norse dwarven tribes, Norse dwarven kingdom, by reestablishing Krakadrak, which we'll mention later, and he also impressed King Cazador by recovering several of his family members and avenging others with an invasion of Krazadrak, or the Black Crag, down in the south, which we just mentioned, something that impressed not only King Cazador, but all the dwarves of the Southern Mountains, who thought that Karazakrak had simply forgotten about them. Moving up a little bit to Zufbar. Zufbar is the center of the Engineers Guild. Now, dwarven guilds are very much an important part of their culture. General societal organization is an important part of their culture, but the guilds, especially the Engineers Guild, is important for both war and society. The Engineers Guild builds all of their cannons, all of their technology, and is responsible for their edge in battle. And Zufbar is the center of the Engineers Guild. Whether it's just simple cannon, bolt throwers, and catapults, or if it's cannons or even the thunder barges, Zufbar makes them there. Zufbar it sits on the Blackwater, so it borders the Empire, and they're most definitely an influence on the Empire's Engineers Guild. Karakadrin is the center of the Slayer's Keep, is the center of the Slayer's cult, and it's led by the Slayer King himself, who's taken an oath to protect and grow the cult of Slayers who worship Grimnir and have sworn to die in battle. These berserkers, now to take that back, as berserkers are actually a whole separate thing, but these warriors are the shock troops of the dwarves, and they go into battle aiming to die. So they are fearless, hard to kill, and very damage dealing. And this is their king himself. Karakadrin is known for, of course, having its huge cult to the Slayer, to Grimnir, its huge temple to Grimnir, the second largest in the entire Karaz Ankor, second only to Karaz Karak, and right past the one in Karak 8 Peaks, which you can't visit because it's covered in orcs. And the rest of the northern World's Edge Mountains holds are still in the hands of orcs and goblins, though because of their proximity to the other non-captured holds, frequent forays are made into them, whether to get Brightstone or Gromneil or recover runic artifacts. So that's plenty of campaigning or mission or Warhammer roleplay opportunities for anybody who's interested in creating those for their games. Now, especially even before the fall of the Karaz Ankor due to the goblins, but especially since then, the dwarves have been expanding past just this original ancestral mountain home and into the Grey Mountains and the Vaults. These are the mountains that are in between the Empire and Talia and the Badlands, and then the Grey Mountains are, so the Vaults are in between the Empire and Talia, and the Grey Mountains are in between the Empire and Britannia. And the dwarves are here as well. The greatest dwarf hold by far is Barakvar, the Sea Gate. And this is the hold that, firstly, has always been a rival to Karaz Karak for leadership of the Dwarven Empire, of the Dwarven people. It's enormously wealthy due to its trading with the outside world, and also its willingness to straddle the line between innovation and also tradition. So it's definitely been a contender for a long time, and it still is. Its king, Brynolf Grundrak, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, is currently a traditionalist, but he leads one of the strongest holds in his command over the border princes, keeping them in line, and also serving as a gateway to the rest of the Karaz Ankor from the sea, keeping it safe from seaborne threats. Moving up into the vaults, we have Karak Hearn, or the Hornhold, led by King Alaric. And this is much of the vaults and the Grey Mountains holds don't have the venerable histories or I don't want to say personality, but they really don't have the personalities that we find in the rest of the Karaz Ankor. And this is because they're essentially survivors or refugee holds. People from holds that fell in the Karaz Ankor wanted to escape the devastation there and ran into the Grey Mountains and the Vaults to have found new holds or find places to escape to. Karak Hearn was one such place. Even though these holds all existed thousands and thousands of years ago, especially even during the time of the War of the Beard, they really grew during the last few thousand years, as they needed to, as the populations from other holds that had fallen got to them. They're not connected necessarily to the Underway, which is the highway that connects all of the dwarven holds of the Karaz Ankor, and so they weren't as susceptible to falling, which is interesting if you think about it, because Karak Izor and the border princes in general are right next to Skaven Blight, so you would think they would have actually fallen quicker to the Skaven, but it's neither here nor there. And of note, though it's not a hold, is Bugman's Brewery, home to Joseph Bugman. It, of course, did fall to a tragic goblin raid, leading Bugman's Rangers to scour the world, offering their services to Imperial or Dwarven armies as they come across them, to fight the goblins into non-existence. But when they were not fighting goblins, they were the most famous brew in all of the old world. Karak Izor is the Copper Mountain, most famous most famous for its copper deposits and also being the largest dwarf hold west of the World's Edge Mountains. And Karak Norn is famous for being fairly poor, which is not something you necessarily want to be famous for, but there it is. They're also the border watch for the Wood Elves, though they have not been at war with them for almost 4 millennia as of the time of the end times. The Dragonback Mountains were once a flourishing dwarven population, but at this junction they are abandoned. They were lost during the Goblin Wars, but if you're looking for what they look like, they are our resident Hobbit-inspired dwarves. The Ekrund or Dragonback Mountains are our inspiration for the Smog Thorin's Company dwarves. And these folks were kicked out of their homes and are now spread across mostly the vaults, and they are dying to get back home and reclaim their mountain home. So if you are looking for a fun adventure for your role-playing dwarven compatriots, this is where you can go. The Dragonback clan is eager to return home. The Norse holds have an entirely separate culture. Now, technically, they are part of the Karaz Ankor, and have at various points in history sworn fealty to the High King of the Dwarves. But the Great King of Krakadrak is also largely independent, largely because of the sheer distance and the trouble of maintaining close relations. Norse is just so far away from the rest of the Dwarven holds, and they're not connected by the same lines of communication. So the Norse holds fall off, and they do have a culture very separate and very much their own. The principal holds up here, Krakadrak, which has just recently been reestablished after having fallen during the war against Chaos in 2302, Krakadorden, Krakaravennake, and Krako Ornsmoken are all dwarven holds in and of themselves. They are not as wealthy or as well established as their southern compatriots, and they are constantly under threat of chaos invasion, mainly from the hordes of trolls, ogres, and giants that roam the lands of the Giants' Home Mountains, which is where they all live. But they do have very strong infantry armies that make up for their lack of artillery. They have a strong navy of longships inspired by their Chaos Norse neighbors. And they are known for their berserkers, which are a special kind of slayer regiment, similar to the ones that we see down south, though with a little bit more of a chaos bend to them from their influences up north. Dwarves are especially resistant to chaos, so even though they've been in this region for thousands of years, they have not been warped by it, which is partially due to their physiology and also due to their the protection of their master runes that have been inscribed on the megalith statues that they put around all of their holds to protect their lands. Less fortunate have been the dwarves of the Mountains of Morn, established several thousand years ago. The dwarves of Karak Azorn, Karak Vrag, and Karak Krakadren did not survive. Oh, Karak Vrag. Unfortunately, they were slaughtered by the ogres roughly 2,000 years ago, and they have not recovered. The Mountains of Morn, of course, are famous for its rich gold deposits, and its trading with the kingdoms of Cathay was much desired by the World's Edge Mountains and the Karaz Ankor in general. But against the fury of the ogres, or rather the hunger of the ogres, these holds simply could not stand, especially without further reinforcement from the Dwarven Empire, which was not in a position to offer it after the Goblin Wars. So at this junction, these dwarves are extinct. A great shame for the dwarves, even more so than the Dark Elves, and one which they won't even talk about except at their highest levels and amongst themselves, are the dawi, or the Fire Dwarves to them, better known as the Chaos Dwarves to us. Inhabiting the Darklands, which is a massive area, in between the Empire and the Kingdom of the kingdoms of the Ogre Kingdoms. The Dawi or the Chaos Dwarves are a dark parody of everything that the Dwarves are. Where the Dwarves are honorable and good, the Chaos Dwarves are sneaky and evil. Where the Dwarves are not necessarily, I want to say, kind, but where the Dwarves are on the side of order, the Chaos Dwarves seek only to destroy. The Chaos Dwarves are a remnant of the great incursion of chaos that occurred 7,000 years prior to now, when the Old Ones left the world involuntarily and the polar gates collapsed. The Dwarves, who had been living all across here at this point and had spread all across the world, were all of a sudden cut off from each other. And while the Dwarves here had their ancestor gods to defend them, nobody was able to defend these Dwarves here. So when chaos came, the Dwarves of the Darklands had no one. And in their desperation to survive, they reached out and prayed, and someone answered. That someone was Hashut, the father of darkness. The father of darkness was none other than a chaos god himself, and ever since then, Chaos Dwarves have been worshipping him, or it, I should say. Dwarves being not humans, they don't change the same way as humans do. They don't have the same level of mutation. It takes many centuries for dwarves to mutate the same way humans do. Instead, their minds mutate. It's been said that the turning to stone is actually that Chaos Dwarves undergo is a symptom of chaos mutation, but that's actually not true. So Chaos Dwarves and sorcerers will turn to stone over the centuries as they use more and more magic. But in actuality, Ranulf Silverthumb turned to stone as well. He was a dwarven rune lord in service of Karaz, and he was almost 2,000 years old, but as he attempted to harness too much runic magic, he also turned himself into stone. So that seems to just be a dwarven physiological response to an excess of magic. So it seems to be that dwarves in general, that's just what happens to them. But in the case of the Chaos Dwarves, they turned their back on the ancestor gods and the ways of their people in response to their own selves feeling abandoned, and instead they built this empire of industry out of slavery of the nearby ogres and orcs and goblins and giants and dragons, and that is what they do in the Darklands. They slave, they build, just like their dwarven cousins. They are still dwarves, so they do have the highest level of craftsmanship. It's just that craftsmanship, rather than being turned into something beautiful or artistic, is being turned towards hate and destruction. The dwarves, for their part, do not talk about them, and they pretend they don't exist, and that they're just not there at all. Another type of dwarf that no longer exists is the Scaranawi, or the Sky Dwarves. These were dwarves that actually lived above the ground and inhabited the old world before the time of the Empire, so roughly 4,500 years ago. They lived alongside the elves in such places as Corvanath and Khazad Crow, Khazad Mingle, Sakbad Varf. These were realms that they inhabited alongside the elves, or just holds that were above the ground. The Sky Dwarves were, of course, still physiologically dwarves, but they had their own High King, much to the chagrin of the High King of the time, and they were said to be of fairer skin and less stout than the dwarves who lived beneath the mountains. It was estimated that these dwarves would soon outnumber the ones who lived beneath the ground if the War of Vengeance hadn't wiped them all out. But unfortunately it did, and these dwarves are now extinct. But it does lead to some interesting modeling opportunities for some combined dwarven and elven armies, or even just dwarves who focus entirely on living outside in the open air rather than under the ground. And finally, we come to the Lost Hold of Karak Zorn. Karaz is the ancestral birthplace of the dwarves. When the first dwarves came out of the Southlands, some refused to go north and follow Grungni's advice and stayed in the Southlands. Unfortunately for them, there are other things that live in the deep jungles, namely this guy here. And while Karaz did survive for many thousands of years, continuing to send occasional reports, their sheer distance from the rest of the Karaz Ankor, as well as the difficulty of traversing the deserts and then jungles of the old world, meant that they did eventually fall. And we did learn from the Lizardmen Chronicles that they did eventually have dealings with the Lizardmen of the Southlands, and it seems like they were eventually dealt with, unfortunately. But we do know a little bit about them. They're from the War of Vengeance. We know that a dwarf was dressed in furs and lizard hide, a bronze pauldron over one shoulder, and a helmet with a fanged crest in the hook of his right arm. On his left side was a mace, also bronze, with a heavy gem affixed to the pommel. His beard was bound in a bronze ringlet, etched with the snarling visage of a serpent. A cloak of exotic feathers cascaded down his back. Now, this was a description of a dwarf from Karaz, and while this dwarf was actually a Tzeentch demon in guise, the fact is that Tzeentch was a master of disguise, and it would be foolish of him to have disguised himself as someone who was false. So I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb and say this is a pretty good description of a standard dwarf thane from Karaz, just because it wouldn't have made a lot of sense for Tzeentch to disguise himself as someone who didn't exist, or who was going to draw extra attention. I'm going to go and say that takes care of our dwarven friends. There are, of course, any number of additional dwarven holds that I didn't talk about. There are minor holds and settlements throughout the world that have their own flavor, and there's, of course, things I missed and just didn't talk about in this show. But that is the dwarves of the Warhammer world in a 33-minute nutshell. Thank you for tuning in today for this video, and if you want to leave any comments below or anything you'd like for me to have added or talk about in the next video, please feel free to do that. And also please click like and subscribe for this video, and I look forward to making the next one. Thanks so much.